Thank you for tuning in to the Worldbuilder's Anvil, episode 130, The Balancing Act.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the Worldbuilder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
And today we're at the Easy Listening Studios doing the Balancing Act.
Thanks for tuning in for Sunday's Smooth Jazz.
And this next song will put you to sleep in under 3 seconds.
This isn't really our format. I think we do better boisterous. We're a little louder generally.
Oh, so people can actually hear us?
Yeah.
Oh.
And be entertained as opposed to put to sleep. Thank you for tuning into the Sleepy Podcast.
The Sleepy Podcast.
I'll bet you there's podcasts about sleeping that purposefully to make you sleep.
I think I've listened to it. Okay.
So the Balancing Act. Yeah.
So essentially what we want to talk about a bit today, and we got to this from a completely different reason, which was talking about in video games, the things that companies do to create what they call balance.
Or what they're shooting for.
And that's always the goal, and it's probably an impossible goal to actually reach, because the problem is sort of like originality. We always have the wrong concept of balance. And balance is not the scales of justice where they're always equally aligned on both sides. Balance is where things are at equilibrium that you need them to be.
That's a great word to use, equilibrium, for it. Because things are going to ebb and flow. You're going to have a sway in your balance.
And sometimes you're going to choose to have something that will look off balance. Like you want that really powerful villain that seems unstoppable, and you need to come up with this device where essentially the hand of God comes down and squashes him at the end because you can't figure out how anyone in the book can.
Yeah, not a big fan of that.
I'm not a big fan of that. But once again, though, there are
plenty of stories that do it.
A lot of stories that do that. So it's about making a choice to get the story that you're working on right, or the country you're working on right. Because if you have the evil country of Mordor, you come up with all of these weapons of war and ways for them to conquer the world, and they're meant to look overpowered to everyone else. I
think I'm going to have to request that you lead on this one because you have the notes in your handwriting, and I cannot read those.
Like I can? Okay.
You wrote it.
All right. So the first thing is we have to start with the math formula. That's the new rule for at least this one episode.
The math formula?
The math formula for this, which is balance does not equal equal. And that's what I was just saying there, but that's an important thing. Balance does not equal equal.
Let's put a little context in it first. Why don't you pick something that we're going to talk about balancing? Because right now we're just keep using the word balance abstractly, and we should probably choose where the balance is, like where it goes.
And because that's one of the things that you have to talk about is where you're looking for balance in your story, in your world building. But let's start off with story versus plot. That's a very common one. Is obviously when you're writing a novel or a short story, you have a plot that goes through. Very rarely is there a successful work that is strictly plot, where everything written is about propelling the plot forward. You have side plots, you have things going on around that help build up the illusion of this pretend scenario that's happening. Because in life, when you're machinating at work to
I didn't say anything.
To take over the manager's job, you have other things that happen along the way. So if you write a story where someone's trying to become king and everything is about him getting from point A to point B, that in itself doesn't feel realistic to a reader, because nothing in life
is too focused.
Is too focused. Yeah. So what are your thoughts about what are ways that you think that you could actually bring balance to story versus plot? Where do you think that balance lays? Because that's really, once again, it's a question of who your audience is.
See, I wasn't going to go with your targeted avatar on this one. I was actually going to go with creativity versus mechanics. Because for me, obviously, you're going to be a little creative when you do plot, but generally, for me, plot is mechanical. Yeah. It is a skeletal structure, the background of your story, and your story is the creative aspect of it. That's all the colorful language. That's all the creative characters and the creative going heres and going theres and the background of like your actual setting.
Yeah.
So just like what you were saying, where you can't just talk about how the story, i.e. the plot, moves forward. Like you actually have to engage the listener in the story because otherwise they're not engaged. It's too mechanical if you're just driving the plot forward. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of great stories where the plot does, you can see it almost like emotion. So you
call it like a plot-driven story?
Yeah. I guess that's not where I wasn't even going to use that term, but that's exactly what I was struggling to say. Where you got a plot-driven story. And I like both kinds. Yeah. Like I'm a big fan of character-driven plots. I'm a big fan of plot-driven story. But without but even in the word driven is the key there. Plot-driven story.
Not 100% plot.
Exactly. Like there's still a balance. It might be more heavily weighted towards the plot or heavily weighted towards the characters, but it's still, they're both there. As opposed to like, if you just read a story where all it is talking about characters and you have no real plot, you're going to get bored.
Yeah. It's
like you're at that point, you're just story description. That's all it is.
You know, and a way to think about it is like, think of a bar scene from a movie. There are two things that
classic
typically could happen with it. You have these two people at the bar and they're talking about how the cappuccinos here just aren't very good. And this discussion goes on, and then they go about their way. One of the two people goes to his office and murders everyone in a sadistic, horribly way to raise Cthulhu back to take over the world.
Because why wouldn't you?
That would be more of a character-driven story. But now if the two people are at the bar talking about the cappuccinos, and then as they're done, someone walks in and they take a shot at the guy who's trying to bring back Cthulhu, then that's really more of a plot-driven story where even though part of the scene was to add some fluff to the story, so even though part of the scene was to add fluff to the story, it in and of itself brought in more of the plot and helped push the story along. So
do you have any other ideas regarding that? Like, do you
regarding specifically story versus plot?
Well, how you would balance story versus plot?
You know,
like, well, do you want to talk about what you've done in your book? Like, did you use anything specific to do that in the book?
Well, essentially, for me, it was an outlining. So I essentially outlined the plot. And when you outline the plot, you know, that could probably get you easily to about 60,000 words. Unless you're me, then it's like 400,000 or 550,000. But not really.
Architect.
Yeah. And that's just about the castle door. But no, so the idea is I sat there and I said, okay, now I kind of looked at, okay, this part is my first act. You know, this part's my second act, my third and fourth act, because obviously I do all 4-act novels. I'm not one of those unoriginal 3-act people.
See episode 129.
Yes. And, but the idea is when you actually do that, you can sit there and go, okay, I have these certain, you know, let's say 5 scenes that are all plot driven in the first act. I have
basically
I'm trying to balance out the story itself.
But what you've created is a recipe. So it's like, I know that for this plot to move forward, I have to have this scene and I have to have this scene with these characters and I have to have this. So as long as you've created a structure for yourself, you've created a frame and now you flesh it out with the story.
And then literally what I'll try and do is I'll say, well, I think this is going to be shorter because it's action and I like to write action very quick. And so I try and balance out where the story is by adding in things with characters who I find interesting, whether or not they're even necessarily even super relevant to the story.
There's your character development.
But I'm developing the characters and I'm taking moments to fill in the story to make the first act a little bit longer, but not, 2/3 of the book. So I'm trying to balance out the length of the book and the length of the acts by adding in character development to bring in. And I do that by looking at the characters who I want to talk more about who wouldn't necessarily need that type of discussion.
The plot outline, I think, might be one of the most important things we can mention in this particular episode, because I think that right there will help really establish your pacing And I think that that's something that I find in a lot of books is sometimes off.
It'll start off really slow and then be super fast to finish up.
One of the best books I ever read, I almost stopped reading it because the beginning is so arduous and it's all character development.
Yeah.
But it's really slow. And it's like, I'm like, when is the plot going to move? Because all they're doing is talking about this guy. And I was like, and my friend was like, you just have to read it. And like literally, it didn't start picking up until, I'm not exaggerating, like page 100, right around there. Like you had to get through 100 pages of stuff and then it got amazing.
Yeah.
I still stand by, even though it's an amazing book by a writer way better than me, you probably could have shaved about 50 pages off in that beginning of that book.
A novel that gets talked a lot about in today's lexicon, Atlas Shrugged. And Atlas Shrugged is it's a very, very long novel. So it's like Dune long. So it's not quite to War and Peace, but it's getting out there.
Yeah.
And maybe even longer than 100 pages worth of character development, and it starts off with someone walking to work and it starts to pull in a lot of the elements that they need to very, very slowly. And for me, if I could have skipped like the first several chapters and started, with like a quick sum up of those, I could have gone right into the book and been very happy. But it's one of those books where I wanted to read it because you keep hearing all the people, especially politically in this country, talking about from either the left perspective or the right perspective. I like to know what they're talking about, not just take their opinion for stuff. And so really, I didn't enjoy it for a long time. And once you start figuring out what the heck the plot even is, and it starts up and it starts moving along, it's a good book. I wouldn't call it a great book. Some of the ideas I think were maybe great in it, but I think some people probably overvalue it because they agree with those ideas rather than vice versa. It's a bit too preachy for me. There are parts of it I didn't really like, but there are other parts of it that were really good. And but it really is exactly what you were just saying. There was a whole bunch of fluff, where and when you understand the book, it makes perfect sense that it was there, but you really did not need it there.
Yeah, there's sometimes a weird balancing act that some movies and some there's a great movie. I'm trying to remember that. I don't think I'll remember the name of it, but I could describe it. Where the balance will be dramatic, where it is a big ebb and flow, where the first half, just like what we're saying with Atlas Shrugged and the book that I was talking about, which might even have been Mind Killer. I'm not sure though, or maybe it was Neverwhere. It was one of those books where one where one side of the story, or like one half of the tale, was really leaning on either just character development or just story before you even got to the plot. And then it seemed like the other whole half of the book was all plot, even though there's some character development. It's like, they did so much of one thing in one half that they didn't need to do as much in the other. And sometimes that works okay, but but I find for me as an audience, they'll lose me.
And once again, that's why all of these questions a lot of times will tie back to who your audience is. Whether you're a game master, you need to know your players. You need to know the people who interact with your fiction, because that will help. Because there's not a correct point of where it goes from plot driven to character driven to a French artistic film. In that spectrum of things, to where there's a right point for it to be. But part of it you have to understand is, if you make a choice to have it very, very plot driven, there are people who will be pushed away from it. If it's balanced, where I like to try and balance my novel story-wise because I like them that way, other people don't like it. And sometimes the story, it won't make sense. So if it's this thing where life is going on D to D, D to D, D to D, and the point is this big thing comes on and it happens so fast, you really need to have the book out of balance, or what we're talking about as balance, because you need it to be like the slow pace, because you're developing that part of the thing, and then something triggers and there's a snap, which you probably didn't hear on the microphone, and all of a sudden the real heart of the plot just leaps out and devours half the novel.
Yeah, there was a movie, and I'm struggling to remember the name of it.
Which is shocking, actually, because I will give Michael credit for one thing only, probably, and I'll take it back later. But he's very good at remembering movies and books that he's read in the past. So it's
I remember the movie very well. The only thing that I mean, at this point in my movie watching career is that I watch so many movies that I don't always remember the titles now. I'll remember the movie, but I won't remember like the title, which is obviously difficult. It makes it if I find something really good, I generally remember the title so I can recommend it to people. Anyway, it's regardless. This one movie that I watched that Sarah and I will turn a movie off. Like we won't waste our time if it's so terrible or whatever. We like to be entertained. And we were watching this movie where it was just barely intriguing enough to keep us curious and keep us watching. Like we got to the point where I'm like, we should turn this off. Like it's not good. We've been bored for the past half hour at least. At this point, it's just morbid curiosity that I'm wondering what the heck is going on.
Was it Batman versus Superman?
No, it wasn't. It was some. I want to say it was an Asian. I'm going to call it a thriller. You could almost call it a horror. Okay. But I would say thriller is a better description. And you're watching it, and a good half, maybe more than half of the movie, the whole beginning, they don't explain anything. Like it's just a guy, and he wakes up in the woods. And I won't get too specific because what I'll do is I'll try to look it up, and we can put it in the show notes. And you have no idea what's going on. There's no explanation as to plot. Like you're on the ride with the character. Like the character seems completely clueless as to what's going on.
It's kind of like the story where no one really has any idea where it's going.
And I'm like, what is going on? Like we got like a good 45 minutes into the movie before you finally get a little bit of the hook, and then they start to explain things a little bit, and then some really crazy stuff happens, and you're like, oh my gosh! And when you finally get what's going on, like you literally don't get it until just before the credits, and they show you. It kind of comes full circle back to the beginning of the movie, and you're like, oh, and it's brilliant.
Yeah.
But my thing is, they almost lost me.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure they lost viewers.
Yeah.
Because they were so unbalanced. Yeah. It's a risk. It's a risk reward that you set up.
And sometimes artistically, don't be afraid to make those choices. Understand the consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I mean, certainly we've done that in the past.
Because some of that stuff is the most brilliant, where you're being sort of ebbed and pulled, and you start to think it's going to go this way, and then it starts to move that way, and you almost feel confused. And I'm like Michael, I will turn stuff off if it's wasting my time.
Yeah, that's my thing. Wasting time.
And so when I get there, I will be like, I'm in one of those things where it's good enough to keep going. Sometimes you actually finish it, and you're like, that was a waste of my time.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
It never happened. But sometimes some of the most brilliant pieces of art happen that way, where it's like,
because you get a big swing,
and something happens, like I said, and this giant monster jumps out and devours the story, and it turns it from this thing that didn't quite make sense but was okay into like this brilliant masterpiece. Maybe not masterpiece, but this like great, awesome story that probably could have only been done in the way they did it.
Right.
But you have to understand, once again, when you find the balance, when you find where you want the scales to be for the piece of work that you're doing, understand there's a cost. No matter what you do, you're going to lose people.
Yeah. And I think an important point here is we're not, or at least I'm not, saying that it has to be balanced.
Yeah.
It can be unbalanced.
But balanced is it's where you want it to be. You want the scales to be at that spot when you're going through it. It might not be equal, but it will be balanced. The scales always balance. Just they're not always at the same height.
I guess the appropriate thing to say would be throughout the entirety of the work, you should have relatively equal quantities of plot and story.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean they have to be balanced throughout the entirety of the work. Yeah. You can be heavy one side for a spell and heavy on the other side for a spell. But just like what Jeff was just saying, be wary that you might lose people because of that.
The classic, I think, mistake, but not for all readers, is when you start the fantasy novel and you read 2,000 pages into it, and you've now learned about the kingdom and the lands, and you've just met the main character. That can happen. Probably not quite 2,000 pages, but that can happen. And I'm sure people who do like that kind of fiction, but understand that other people will be turned off by that choice to do that.
I feel like we could just keep going with story versus plot.
So we're actually going to hop down to the next one.
Let's go to the next one.
Overpowered characters.
Which we love, but...
because, I mean, if Darth Vader was just a little bit better, you would be like, yeah. But Darth Vader... You felt like there's no way Luke and Han can stop Darth Vader. And then you meet the Emperor, you're like, oh my God, these guys are screwed.
Not only that, but they have the entire power of the Empire behind them. Like, how can this little ragtag group of like non-organized, rebels take out this galactic empire?
Mm-hmm. And you root with them the whole way because you want them to.
Because you want the underdog in there.
There's nothing wrong with overpowered characters to a point. And I will argue with this at a point in individual stories. I think there are stories that really screw it up. For instance, if you make The Matrix, you can't make a sequel. You can't do it. It can't be good. It can't be good. When you tell the story of someone dying and coming back and becoming all powerful, if they're in the next story, it can't be good. Because you have the all powerful character in there. You have the Oz, you can fly around and do whatever you want to. And then they have to make up really weak plot devices to try and make it. Well, Neo just can't happen to be there right now. He can control anything in the world now. But he's going to get pulled off to that part. He doesn't need to go there. He can manipulate the world from his head. But you have to come up with fake devices to try and keep the tension because you have an overpowered character in there.
Well, it's like the Superman conundrum. It's one of the things that makes Superman
probably the most difficult character to make.
Yeah, it makes him uninteresting is that he's too powerful. It's like, how do you make him interesting? Mm-hmm. Whereas characters like Spider-Man and Batman are super interesting because they're lacking.
They're a bit breakable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but there is a balancing act you can make. Usually in most fiction, the more powerful characters are almost always the bad guys. Why? It creates the tension for you when you're following your hero's journey.
Because how's he going to get past that problem?
That's right. And sometimes where you're unsure is when you have your sort of stranger stories. The preacher comes to town. And everyone's saying he looks really tough because of the collar, I think. And they're sitting there, and this whole preacher comes in, and he's the main character, and he might be overpowered, and early interactions will indicate him that way. And if he stays that way throughout the story, it could make an enjoyable action story, but it will lose some people. The thing to keep in mind with overpowering characters is be careful to fall into the trap to where if you create a foe that's so powerful that there is no realistic way anything in the story can stop him, you have the classic Hand of God conundrum where and Monty Python would do it the best, where literally a cardboard foot would come down and squash something. You can do that, and that happens in stories all the time. Where all of a sudden, we forgot about the upgrade to the phaser banks. We just didn't attach them to the phasers. Now we can defeat the enemy.
Yeah. When something comes out of the middle, so when something that has not been explained or mentioned at all comes in generally at the end. And then poof, it totally derails the story or solves the problem more often.
I have an important question here for you now, though. This is really now. If I use both Star Wars and Star Trek lingo, do we have to mark the episode explicit?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, good.
Not explicit, maybe sacrilegious. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Live long and prosper.
No, I thought you were going to add something. I thought you were going to make an analogy, a Star Wars and Star Trek analogy in the same.
We did.
Well, you said
we're talking about the Emperor, and then I talked about phasers after the Emperor and Darth Vader. Phasers are Star Trek.
Well, I know that, but was that a specific? Were you referencing a specific phaser thing from Star Trek, or just generically using the word?
Because I use a word from Star Trek, and I was talking about Star Wars.
I think we can let it slide. We can let it slide this time.
Please don't report us.
I won't. I'm trying to think of a specific example, but I'm actually coming up blank right now of a story where you have that, where something like it's completely... Well, actually, what comes to mind is a War of the Worlds. War of the Worlds, the people are fighting against the aliens. They're trying to figure out what can we do. And it's an absolutely overpowered force that humankind could not stop. They're more advanced technologically. They're more powerful physically. And then they just get killed by bacteria at the end. I could say spoilers after I've spoiled it. It's a 60-year-old fiction. I'm not worried about it. But the point is that like that's, if you ask me, that's not good storytelling. Like there was no part that the people of the world did anything to that, and maybe that was the point of it, is the helplessness of humanity. But as far as story goes, like that's not, it's Deus Ex Machina.
I mean, pretty much any story pre Renaissance was that way. And the funny thing was, in the Renaissance, they tried to pull it back so far where you would then have to go in front of these academias to prove of your story's worthiness to be put onto stage, that you'd have to prove not only was there no hand of God in there, but like sequentially, time-wise, the story would make sense. And one of the great stories would be about this story called El Cid, which was about the Spanish Reconquista. It was supposed to be this realistic, epic story where this guy raises an army, and timeline, if you look at the timeline through the story, all the events take place within a specific timeline, but essentially he like pulls up this giant army and defeats the Moors in like 24 hours. Come on.
Yeah, it's unrealistic.
But and there were huge arguments in the Renaissance about, did this qualify? Can we call it this? We don't know. And huge arguments. And these things do shift over time. But the one thing is I'm like Michael. I feel let down when I finish a story, and I feel like the author or the person creating the video game or the game master at the table had to pull something out of their proverbial behind that was needed to finish the story, because it takes away from the next thing we're going to get into, which is
just about to say, this agency.
Character agency. Yeah. There are two forms of character agency in fiction, and there's a lot less in the written word.
Think first, speak second. You're doing it out of order. Think first, then speak.
Blah.
No, you're still speaking first. I want to like kind of give a little definition of agency. I'm fairly confident that anybody listening to this probably understands the concept of character agency, but the basic gist is that the character or the player, if you're a GM, this is like what we're leading into, is how this affects GM and tabletop gaming, is that the characters, that your players should have an influence and an impact on the story and the plot, how things change based on their actions. If they don't, they have no agency. Like, I'll give you a great movie example. Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Indiana Jones has no agency in that movie whatsoever. And a lot of people don't realize this, but you think about it.
It's a real game.
He fights against the Nazis to get the Ark, but they still get it. He tries to, he's up against them the whole movie, but they still take it away. They still get it. They still do the ritual. They still crack it open. If Indiana Jones never was there,
nothing would have changed.
Everything would have occurred the exact same way. They still would have stolen the Ark. They still would have cracked it open, and they still would have all been killed by it. Indiana Jones had no agency in that story whatsoever. Now everyone loves the story because we love Indiana Jones. It's a fun movie, but as far as character agency goes, he was completely inconsequential to the plot.
In movies and in books, there is such a thing as character agency, but it's literally the characters in the book. What impacts do their actions make upon the world? In the context we're about to talk about, it's more from the perspective of interactive fiction, whether it be, like you said, role-playing games, board games, or video games.
Yeah, even video games.
And so, but he's completely correct in saying that character agency is an important thing in those mediums, because in general, people like playing games where they feel like they're changing something. And sometimes you'll even hear the criticism, well, I don't feel like it made any difference. And even some of my favorite video games, the Bethesda, Elder Scrolls, and Fallout games, do a great job of giving you agency in certain areas and not in other areas. And sometimes there has to be boundaries because of limitations of, well, you can't really create everything in the universe in a video game. In a role-playing game,
you draw the line. You got to draw the line somewhere.
But still, at some point, there has to be a story behind the game, at least for me to find it enjoyable.
So the basic gist that we're getting to when it comes to tabletop role-playing is, as a GM, certainly like what we were talking about before, when you make a skeleton, a framework of your plot, Yeah, like you want to kind of keep the players towards that plot because you spent time creating it. You've got a good story that you want to share with them. But at the same time, you can't remove all the players' agency. If they decide to go off the rails and you can't either get them back to the plot, in a nice way, or they're just not doing it, then you have to let them go. You can't just put up a blocker and force them back into the plot line. Like that's not good for the player. It's not good for the story. It's not good gaming. It's not good storytelling. That removes all the agency of the player. And in that circumstance, you might as well just verbally tell them a story than allow them to play a game.
Yeah. And there are some games that are very successful. They're called rail games, and people do enjoy playing them. But realistically, the game always follows the same path, no matter who's behind the controller.
Yeah.
So there's a game with 0 player agency, except for the fact that Michael might be able to jump over one more log than I can.
Yeah. And there's plenty of great games like that.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
And we're not saying don't make games like that, but realize that that's one of the things you have to balance out as well, is how much agency do you give the people? And can you lie about it? Like I was talking about, like Bethesda games, they have a huge open world. You can skip every bit of story in the world that you want to, or get heavily involved in all the story you want to. And so there's a great agency at that level in their games. But when you get into parts of the game where you're actually dialoguing with people, the more complicated and larger their games get, the less agency you actually have in the conversations. The response takes you down to the same path almost every time. Like if you're sarcastic, they respond like, "Oh, don't be mean to me." And then they say the exact same thing that if you would have picked a non-sarcastic choice from.
I'm reminded of a game called Spec Ops: The Line. And that game has a wonderful illusion of agency. The game is on rails. It's definitely on rails. You can only follow the path that they've set before you. But there is an illusion of agency because there are choices to be made in the game. One of the best, more modern stories in a straight shooter action game. And it's really great. But what I find even more interesting is take a little time and take a look at the backstory of how they created the game and what they did to create the game, both with the storytelling, and I literally mean like the recording of the voices for the voiceovers for the characters, and how they wrote it, because there were certain parts of it that were incomplete when they wrote the story, and there were certain stuff where the producers were insistent on certain things being in the game when they were like, well, with the way the story has changed, we can't keep that in the game anymore. It has to be removed. So like there's a lot of great stuff to be discovered about that game and how they balanced it.
Yeah.
So Spec Ops: The Line, great game. If you can't play the game, at the very least, look up how it was created.
And one of those things, character agency, a lot of times is based on a genre. In action, you get away a lot more with stuff needing to happen. Like you have to go do this mission this way to proceed to the story. And usually when you're playing those kind of games, you want the adventure and you don't care so much. You enjoy the story as it's happening, but it's really about beating the next mission. Where in other games, a lot of times it's about the world and how things evolve and the role playing aspect of it. And in those games, agency is much more important.
And that kind of lends itself back to story versus plot. Like in the games where you're just rifling through the missions because you just want to complete and complete and complete. Whereas other games where you just want to meander through the world and experience. Like look at all the books in Skyrim. Just there's books upon books upon books to be read. Like you don't have to read it; you can throw them all over your shoulder. But there's a lot of stuff that they built into that game to create a rich world.
My favorite thing in Skyrim is because of there's so much, like I said, agency in the world part of it. It was like literally it's like, okay, today I'm going to go get that power word, which will make my shouting ability much more impressive. So I'm going to go to the castle over that hill and I'm going to kill whatever is there. And I'm going to take that word. Oh, butterfly.
Butterfly, yes. Hey, the butterflies led me to a cave. I don't know about this cave. What's in the cave? Was I going to a whatever cave?
Yeah. What was I doing?
That game, it was like Grand Theft Auto, where you might have a task in mind and then just meander, and you always get caught doing something else. Skyrim.
That was actually always my problem with Grand Theft Autos. I didn't enjoy the missions very much, but I liked stealing the cars and driving around and being distracted, just interacting in the world. But I couldn't get to that part because I haven't flown the airplane.
Yeah.
Who cares? But once again, it's about who your audience is, and I'm not your audience for that game.
All right. What's next on the list?
That is it. But
no, I think we definitely want to talk a little bit about life balance versus creativity and hobby balance.
I completely skipped that.
You did? Yeah. Did you want to skip? Do you want to do that for another episode? Because it is a big topic.
Yeah, I think we're going to do that for another episode.
Okay.
Because that is, but creativity versus life is an important thing. But let's move on to what is I'll do the world building task for today since I made you do it last time.
Okay.
So the world building task for today is go ahead and take the story you're developing now and actually plot it out and sit there and go, where are my acts at? How much of the story in there is actually plot driven? Are there parts of the story that are a lot longer than other parts? And can I use actual story elements to flesh out the story and the characters in different areas to level that out? Do I not want to? But really think about, the flow of your story and the context of it from an outline form.
Yeah, plot outline. I think that's a great task, great world builder task.
And now for the real world task of the day, we come to Michael Miller at the World Series.
Real world task of the day. Well, I mean, we have a lot of great references here, so I'm going to say that you should definitely go out and watch Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and do some digging in on the background of Spec Ops: The Line. And if you don't play or own Fallout or Skyrim or Elder Scroll, you should. Just go buy one and play it.
Just go buy
Skyrim. And
hold off to Skyrim.
Well, Skyrim's coming to the next gen.
Well, that's what I'm saying is hold off for Skyrim right now. Go get Fallout 4. Just play for an hour or two. And
you're like a drug dealer.
That's right. Your first hour is free.
I can only play. I can play just for an hour or two. No, you cannot. That's Fallout doesn't work that way.
Yeah. I have no idea what I'm talking about because now I'm thinking about Fallout. I have to go. Really quickly, I have to leave.
Do you have a tease for the next episode?
Yes, I do. And the next episode, we'll be getting back to the game.
Enter the wine steward.
And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builder's Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us in this episode of the World Builder's Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.